Okay, so well, welcome everyone again. So this is the last session for this semester. Although next week, as I was anticipating, we're going to have a workshop on relational quantum mechanics. So if you guys are interested, drop me an email. So that's officially the last meeting, but we're going to see each other again if you like. So today I'm very pleased to have Jessica Wilson and giving a talk, and James Ladyman giving comments. So Jessica is well, I guess you all know her, but to give a short presentation, she's a professor in philosophy at University of Toronto. She works mostly in metaphysics, epistemology. She recently published this book on Metaphysical Emergence, which I strongly recommend if you're interested in the topic, but also if you have a vague interest in philosophy of science. I think it's a very good book. And today she's going to present part of this book, especially chapter 2, I think, and 5 mostly, which is on complex systems. So the book is basically, I mean, the product of over 20 years, I would say, of work on this topic. I can't remember the first, the super duper physicalism, I think it's 2000 or 1999, something like that.
1999.
So it's over 2 decades. Yeah. So yeah, Jessica, whenever you want.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss my work here in this forum, and thanks to everybody for attending and to James for being my discussant. So my handout strategy is basically to give you a very short paper. Think of it as a souvenir. Long handouts. So what I plan to do is, it's kind of like a précis, so to speak, of you know, a line of thought in my book, which is focused, the book overall is focused on this question of can we take certain appearances of co-temporal, what I call, I'll explicate these terms in more detail later, but broadly co-temporal, by which I mean you know, synchronic but not necessarily instantaneous dependence of some seemingly higher level entities, paradigmatically special science entities or features, and yet couple on some lower level configurations, typically understood to be physical or physically acceptable configurations, coupled with a kind of autonomy, both ontological and causal, so distinctness and distinctive efficacy. So I'm interested in this question really about whether we can make sense of appearances in the first instance inspired by the special sciences, but I think more generally, you know, our own ordinary experience of, you know, the world of macroscopia, as well as our own introspective experience of ourselves as both dependent and yet in these certain respects autonomous from the lower level, ultimately physical, fundamental physical configurations that constitute us. Can we make sense of those appearances, and if so, how? Both in principle, and then there's this further question about whether you know, certain phenomena that one might wonder whether they are metaphysically emergent, whether they can be understood to be metaphysically emergent. So in my book, I argue that there's really, with respect to these target phenomena that are inspired by this seemingly leveled structure of special science goings on lower level and ultimately fundamental physical goings on, I argue that there's really two schematic approaches for making sense of those appearances. One of them is what I call strong emergence. This would, if there were any such strong emergence, and physicalism understood as the view that all the broadly scientific phenomena are completely metaphysically dependent, nothing over and above in some respect, compatible with non-reduction. Physical goings on, that would be incompatible with this notion of strong emergence. And then there's a weaker notion of emergence, which I call weak emergence, which is compatible with physicalism. And then again, in the book, I go through and I consider complex systems, ordinary objects, qualitative consciousness and free will as candidate phenomena, and I consider what cases can be made for their being either weakly or strongly emergent. I think kind of interestingly, today I'm going to focus on complex systems. I think interestingly, in most of these cases, existing reasons for thinking that they are even weakly emergent don't actually close the deal. So what I'm going to do I'm going to talk about some cases that have been made for complex systems being either strongly emergent or weakly emergent. I'm going to argue initially that none of those cases actually seal the deal for complex systems to be even weakly emergent, but then I'll provide my own preferred account of weak emergence, and I'll argue that it does in fact apply to some complex systems. And along the way, I'm going to talk about my preferred implementations of weak emergence and strong emergence, where my preferred implementation of weak emergence appeals to an elimination in degrees of freedom, and my preferred implementation of strong emergence appeals to the coming into play of a novel fundamental interaction. Okay. As far as I know, this group is a Quantum Foundations group. I think there are going to be some connections to quantum phenomena. I mean, among other things, one of the cases to be made is one which relies on the fact that certain quantum degrees of freedom get eliminated in the classical limit. So there are going to be some, more or less direct connections to quantum concerns or philosophy of quantum mechanics. But we can also discuss in Q&A in particular some, other questions about whether there might be metaphysical emergence, say, at the quantum level, or some other candidate cases for metaphysical emergence that I won't be discussing. So, for example, some have suggested that quantum entanglement involves metaphysical emergence. Some have suggested that space-time emerges one way or another from quantum goings-on. So I'm happy to discuss those in Q&A. But this, at least, this attention to the metaphysical emergence of complex systems, I think will be useful in any case, just to, or I hope it will be interesting to those who are attending the talk, just to see a sort of paradigm case of application of some of these notions of metaphysical emergence. And, then we can discuss whether these might apply to certain other contexts, more specifically quantum contexts, or not. Okay. All right. So what are the target cases I'm interested in? I want to start by just sketching some of the prima facie appearances that I take to suggest that, on the face of it, natural reality does exhibit this kind of layered structure. Of course, it's not like a layered cake, right? There's a lot of complexity and interaction and everything else, but the idea is that, it's not just swirling atoms in the void, or it's not just, the interacting fields, but there's other goings on besides just whatever those fundamental physical goings on turn out to be. I think in the first instance, these are inspired by, attention to the special sciences and their taxonomies, for example, their laws, as well as this, broadly scientific consensus that, there really is just physical substance, like the only substance is physical substance. By the way, just by way of an aside, the kind of the understandings that I'm going to offer of weak and strong metaphysical emergence as sufficient unto accommodating these appearances could, they're not specifically such as to appeal to, the supposition that the only substance is physical substance. We can apply more, the schemas will apply more generally to, like if there was fundamental ectoplasmic substance, you could still make sense. You could apply these schemas for metaphysical emergence to, different kinds of understandings of the fundamental base. But for purposes of this talk, I'm just going to be assuming that, something like physical monism is the target supposition behind these appearances. So here more specifically are some of the considerations that I think to support the idea of there being metaphysical emergence understood as coupling this kind of co-temporal dependence along with some degree of distinctness and distinctive efficacy, or, as I sometimes put it, ontological and causal autonomy. So first of all, it's standardly assumed that the only matter, the only substance is physical matter or substance. So, Cartesian dualism or any kind of, hardcore substance dualism is ruled out. It's also standardly assumed in scientific context that the features of a macro entity over a temporal at a time or over a temporal interval are at least in part a function of features of the base level configurations over that interval. And then again, the distinctive special science taxonomies and laws. On the face of it, special science entities and features are classified under types that are different from the types that under which, even complex fundamental physical goings on are classified under, and special science laws governing these special science entities and features. By features, I just mean generally properties, behaviors, and so on, are apparently different from the laws governing the lower level, ultimately fundamental physical entities and features, including configurations thereof. Another consideration that's sometimes cited as supporting this idea of, metaphysical emergence, a certain understanding of leveled reality are universal properties and behaviors, according to which many special science entities, so for example, complex systems like thermodynamic systems, exhibit features that are functionally independent of various features of underlying microconfigurations. Another consideration is perceptual unity. So this adverts to conscious creatures like us. So, even though science tells us that, macro objects are in fact materially constituted by complex, constantly changing microconfigurations, these ordinary objects don't appear to us in that way. They appear to be comparatively stable, unified entities. And there's other considerations too. We give them names like Jessica Wilson, for example, the Eiffel Tower, for another example. Another, I think, a very interesting consideration, which I want to do more to develop in future work, is this idea that there's compositional flexibility associated with the existence and the persistence of macro entities, as well as their features. So the idea is that, the identity, so to speak, of macroscopia appears to transcend the identity of any specific micro configurations upon which it depends. So, our physical constitution is constantly changing, but we continue on. We're not constantly going out of existence and so on. So similarly with various of our features. So there seems to be a kind of abstraction, that's associated with our mode of being, or the mode of being of macro objects and features that, suggests that we're not identical, so to speak, to any specific configurations, or there's even certain reductive strategies for making sense of this appearance that I won't get into, but right at this point, but we'll talk about later. But on the face of it, it looks like, our persistence conditions, for example, are just different from the persistence conditions of entities upon which we depend. So I want to just offer a couple of clarifications by way of, getting clear about the kind of understanding of the appearances that's associated with metaphysical emergence. So first of all, there's tons of, there's many different accounts of these appearances. Some of them are broadly deflationary, so you can be a reductive physicalist and you can say, well, I'm not going to take those appearances at face value. I really privilege parsimony, so I'm just going to try and make do with one level. All there are are the massively complex physical goings-on. And these appearances are given an epistemic, appearances of higher level structure are given an epistemic or pragmatic spin. And then there's also these inflationary understandings of the appearances, according to which, like maybe a substance pluralist view. Okay, so a substance pluralist view is one that also would accommodate the appearances of there being leveled structure. The question about like the kind of dependence that's at issue there, I guess, though, is up for grabs. But what's distinctive about metaphysical emergence is not that it's the only way of making sense of leveled reality. Okay, so there are deflationary and inflationary ways of, quote, making sense of the appearances of leveled structure. But it wants to do it in a certain way, namely, give a realistic account of the appearances that is not, inflationary in the way that substance dualism was. So it aims to realistically accommodate the appearances of structure in a way that's compatible with material or physical monism. So I sometimes kind of capture this idea of physical or material monism, as a background presupposition, contrasting with substance dualist accounts or pluralist accounts of leveled structure by talking about co-temporal material dependence, right? That's that issue in metaphysical emergence. And this dependence condition also involves usually it's understood to involve certain kind of, have certain modal implications, including that these emergent goings-on, they don't float free from their base in this, we're supposing the physical goings-on, right? They require, right? So anytime you've got one of these, a special science entity, there's some lower level physical goings-on, right, that are on the scene. And moreover, when those physical goings-on are on the scene, then they necessitate somehow or another the existence, with at least nomological necessity, they necessitate the existence of the higher level goings-on. So I'll sometimes use this expression, they minimally nomologically necessitate, right, the emergence and so on. Or you can say that the emergent minimally nomologically supervenes on base level goings-on. Very important to realize that the target case is kind of reflected in this necessitation presupposition. The target conception of emergence is not one that encodes or is trying to understand this dialectically uninteresting fact that wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, wholes typically have properties that their parts don't have. So everybody accepts that, including reductionists. So if you want to try to make sense of this one level view, the idea is not that metaphysical emergence is not that easy to come by, okay? Or at least that's not the conception of metaphysical emergence that's at issue in trying to make sense of leveled structure. What's at issue in these, these cases of seeming co-temporal material dependence with ontological and causal autonomy is it some kind of relation between a higher level entities and features and lower level configurations? Maybe it's a plurality, maybe it's a lower level aggregate, relational aggregate. There's different options there depending on how you're understanding the lower level basis, but it's not a relation between, the properties of a whole and a property of a part. Okay, that's, there's plenty of that, and everyone allows that. The properties, wholes typically have properties or features that their individual parts don't have. Everyone grants that. That's not what's at issue here. We're trying to understand how it could be that, like, you have a configuration of some sort, lower level configuration that necessitates the emergent, right? And nonetheless, in spite of this dependence relation, this guy has a certain degree of ontological and even some kind of causal autonomy, right, vis-a-vis the lower level configuration that necessitates it or upon which it supervenes. Okay. So the primary challenge to, trying to take the appearances of leveled structure seriously as per, metaphysical emergence is, or really I guess more generally, just the primary challenge to taking it seriously in any way, is offered by Kim in his, his work on causal overdetermination. So I imagine that most of you are at least passingly familiar with Kim's style concerns, according to which, in particular, if you allow that some higher level entity exists, it's distinct from its base level configuration of the goings on upon which it minimally nomologically supervenes. You want to allow that the higher level entity or feature is capable of causing, let's say, is capable of causing some physical effect. Now, if you're a physicalist, you're going to think that any physical effect has, a completely sufficient physical cause. So without loss of generality, you can assume that it's the thing, the physical goings on upon which the higher level goings on minimally nomologically supervene. So the physical goings on are producing that effect, and then you're allowing that some distinct entity also produces, that same effect. So you've got what on the face of it looks like causation twice over. You can run a similar line if the higher level entity is producing another higher level effect. Okay, so there's a slightly more complex case there. But it's interesting to note that you can understand a lot of the main views, main positions in the metaphysics of science as kind of responses to Kim's concern. So, one way to avoid overdetermination is just to be a reductive physicalist. Then you just say, well, really, there's just the physical goings on. So you really only have the one entity that causes the one thing. No problem there. If you go substance dualist, you're really saying, well, as a matter of fact, physical causal closure, according to which every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause, that's not true. You've got some, there's going to be some effects, physical effects in particular, that the higher level substance can cause that the physical can't cause, but you reject dependence, right? So this is why substance dualism is not a form of metaphysical emergence, okay? If you go epiphenomenalist, you're saying that really maybe you've got distinctness, you've got the higher level entity, but in fact it doesn't cause anything, so you don't get causal overdetermination that way. If you, what was the other one? Oh, eliminativism. So you just say, well, in fact, there aren't any higher level goings on. If you're a reductive physicalist, you're saying, oh yeah, there's a sense in which, for example, a cell or a tree exists, but really, strictly speaking, it's identical to some or other physical goings on. And eliminativist is saying, well, in fact, there aren't any such things in the first place. So those are all non-emergentist responses to Kim, but there's two emergentist responses to Kim associated with, on the one hand, this idea of strong emergence that was first endorsed by British emergentists such as John Stuart Mill and C.D. Broad and others. So this is a kind of anti-materialist, anti-physicalist form of emergence. It's related in the sense, the idea is that really the physical goings on don't, in fact, in some cases, even if there's a sense in which they do cause these guys, they only do it in virtue of necessitating this emergent going on, right? But on this kind of view, you reject physical causal closure. I'll say a little bit more about this down the line. And then the other form of emergence that has been offered in response to Kim's style concerns is associated with non-reductive physicalism, according to which, look, there is, in fact, both of these guys are causing the same effect, but the overdetermination is not problematic. It's not of the firing squad variety. The relationship between the emergent and its base goings on is a very intimate one, and somehow you're going to make sense of how it's not problematic, that they're in some sense both causing the same thing. Okay, so those are two emergentist strategies for responding to Kim, and I argue, I basically use those strategies encoded in British emergentism and diverse forms of non-reductive physicalism, respectively, to characterize these two schemas for metaphysical emergence. And then I go on in the book, to argue that each of these is in principle viable in the sense that they're coherent, they're naturalistically acceptable, they do in fact avoid Kim-style concerns, and so on. So let me say a little bit more about each of these forms of emergence. So first, there's strong emergence. So here, what it is for token feature S to be strongly metaphysically emergent from some token. I'm going to focus on features. To be honest, actually, I'm going to go back and forth sometimes to talk about strong emergence or weak emergence of features, sometimes of entities. There's translation strategies. Nothing really important hangs on this. So what it is for a token feature S to be strongly metaphysically emergent from a token feature P, physical feature assumed on a given occasion, is for it to be the case on that occasion that S co-temporally materially depends on P, and that S has at least one token power not identical with any token power of P. Again, this dependence condition encodes substance monism and minimal nomological supervenience. And this second condition captures the strong sense in which an emergent feature may be causally and hence ontologically autonomous, right, vis-a-vis the base feature in virtue of having a fundamentally novel power, one that is not had by the base feature, or in any case is not had by it in the same way, right? At best, the base feature has that power, not directly, but only in virtue of necessitating the strong emergent that really has that power. Okay. And again, base feature is a feature of a configuration, and the novelty of the power should be understood accordingly. And moreover, I want to emphasize that S's novel power is not just non-fundamentally novel, right, as reflecting, say, a merely aggregative difference between the powers of a composed entity and the powers of its components, but it's rather fundamentally novel. This is because P itself is a feature of a configuration. So P has already any non-fundamental powers that attach just to the mere aggregation of its lower level components, okay? So that's important to realize. So I don't actually encode explicitly in the schema for strong emergence that the power is fundamentally novel, because if I were to put that, it might incorrectly imply that, somehow a higher level entities having a non-fundamentally novel power was an option, but it's not, given that P, in fact, has all the non-fundamental powers that are associated just with mere aggregation. Okay, so you can see easily that for strong emergence, it's straightforward that you satisfy these appearances of co-temporal material dependence that's just built in, and then the autonomy is distinctive efficacy is straightforward because you have this fundamentally novel power, and if S has a fundamentally novel power that P doesn't have or doesn't have in the same way, then by Leibniz's law they're distinct. So you get this the basic features of metaphysical emergence, of co-temporal metaphysical dependence, along with ontological and causal autonomy. Okay. Now weak emergence, similar condition on co-temporal material dependence, and then here though the difference lies in the how you generate the autonomy, how you satisfy the autonomy conditions. Here, the idea is that the higher level feature has a non-empty proper subset of the token powers had by its base feature on a given occasion. So this is a weak sense in which, and I want to say the second condition encodes this weaker sense, comparatively weaker sense, in which a base feature can be ontologically and causally autonomous vis-a-vis its, emergent feature can be ontologically and causally autonomous vis-a-vis its base configuration feature. Now, if two features have are associated with different sets of powers, different collections of powers, then they're going to be distinct by Leibniz's law. So ontological distinctness is straightforward, but then the real action for making sense of weak emergence concerns how to make sense of causal autonomy or distinctive efficacy, given that every power of the weak emergent is token identical, right? On any given occasion, a weak emergent does not have any new powers, right, vis-a-vis its base configuration. So if it doesn't have any new powers, how can it be distinctively efficacious? And as I have argued, and this goes back to the 1999 paper, the distinctive efficacy of a weakly emergent feature is located in the having of a distinctive power profile. And this profile reflects, for example, difference-making considerations. So, if my thirst had been realized a little bit differently, I would have still reached for the Fresca, or the glass of water, as the case may be. And it's also, you can make sense of this difference-making considerations or comparatively abstract levels of causal or nomological grain of the sort that are associated with these different systems of laws and so on. So this is kind of a way of getting at the idea that there's, different kind of levels of abstraction with respect to causal grain. So the lower level physical goings on, the causal grain is highly fine-grained, right? Whereas at higher levels and reflecting, things like the compositional flexibility or different persistence conditions and so on, the causal grains are more coarse-grained. Okay, so I think these distinctive power profiles are encoding this, these differences, more or less difference-making considerations. So then my suggestion is that there's two ways for a feature to be distinctively efficacious as compared to its dependence-based feature. Either you can have more powers, and that's strong emergence, or you can have fewer powers, and that's weak emergence. And that's it. Those are your only options. More powers, fewer powers. If you want causal distinctness, those are your only options. So for the cases that are our focus, trying to make sense of these appearances, those are your options. Weak emergence, strong emergence. Okay, now turning to complex systems, they are very commonly offered as emergent by both scientists and philosophers. And, these systems take many different forms. Some of them are natural, such as turbulent water flows or phase transitions, weather patterns, and so on. There's also, artificial complex systems, for example, associated with Conway's game of life. And there's no specific agreed upon definition of complex systems. And here, James's work is relevant, but some commonly highlighted characteristics are as follows. So nonlinearity, that's perhaps the most salient one. Certain features of complex systems cannot be seen as linear or other broadly additive combinations of features of the system's composing entities. And relatedly, the mathematical expressions that describe the evolution of such systems contain nonlinear terms. This nonlinearity is also associated with extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. So for chaotic complex systems, the butterfly effect, small differences in initial conditions can result in huge differences in trajectory or behavior. There's another feature, epistemic feature of unpredictability. The precise behaviors of complex systems are unpredictable and relatedly often surprising and seemingly novel. Another interesting feature, algorithmic incompressibility. The dynamic equations of complex systems don't admit of analytic or closed solutions, so that the only way to find out what the behavior will be is to kind of set up the system, let it roll, and see what happens. There's also a feature we'll be discussing in what follows, universal behavior or universality. According to this, compositionally different complex systems may exhibit highly similar behavior. And another feature that we'll be looking at down the line is self-organization. Complex systems exhibit coherent patterns arising as a result of interactions among the parts in a way suggesting that they are self-organizing. So it's been common, actually, especially among philosophers of science, trying to make sense of these appearances of emergence, is to pick one or other of these features and craft an account of weak emergence around the feature. So we'll be discussing some of those cases down the line. Okay. Well, actually, sorry, I'm going to first discuss certain cases that have been made, especially historically, but even some contemporary philosophers suggest that complex systems are strongly emergent as well as weakly emergent. Okay, so with respect to the question, might complex systems be strongly emergent? Here again, we can go back to the British emergentists. Now, you might have certain of their lines of thought might be used or appealed to suggest that straightforward complex systems are strongly emergent because they assume that nonlinearity and relatedly in-principle unpredictability was indicative of fundamental novelty. Now, this assumption was reasonable at the time. It was reflecting this common understanding of causal interactions, according to which these involved fundamental forces such as gravity and electromagnetism, which operated in accord with linear composition laws. So, under that assumption, if no new fundamental forces were operating, then you should be able to predict the behavior of a composite system as a linear combination of the forces that were associated with the composing parts. Conversely, failures of composite systems to be subject to linear analysis were at that time reasonably thought to indicate that some additional fundamental force, a force that was not operative at less complex levels of natural reality, was now in operation. So this is why British emergentism and strong emergentism of a more general variety is associated with this idea of a fundamental configurational force or a fundamental configurational interaction, as per Brian McLaughlin's really great paper, The Rise and Fall of British Emergentism. Now, of course, the discovery of and the creation of nonlinear complex systems, which clearly did not involve any novel fundamental interactions, has undercut this kind of inference from nonlinearity or associated unpredictability to fundamental novelty, right, of the sort that's at issue in strong emergence. Okay, so we don't have that straightforward route to strong emergence anymore. Now, there are some, more recently, some philosophers have suggested that certain other features of complex systems might be suggestive of fundamental novelty. So, for example, Silverstein and McGeever suggest that relational holism, as potentially operative in complex systems, might give rise to fundamentally new powers, or as they put it, irreducible causal capacities. And you could also check out Thompson and Varela on this sort of relational holism. And Menon and Callender interpret Bob Batterman's claim that thermodynamics is correct to characterize phase transitions as real physical discontinuities. It's correct to represent them mathematically as singularities. They interpret his discussion there as signaling that he's committed to phase transitions being strongly emergent. Okay. Now, my own view is that that's not what Batterman has in mind, and there, we can also wonder whether relational holism is sufficient unto, like, why would we understand that in terms of strong emergence? This is related actually to the question of whether quantum entanglement involves some kind of emergence, for example, of the sort that Silverstein and McGeever have got in mind, right, for complex systems. They also suggest that quantum entanglement might, see you later, might involve some kind of relational holism. But, I'm concerned that their case is building in this supposition that, if a whole or relational system has some kinds of features that its individual parts don't have, then that suffices for metaphysical emergence. But as we've already discussed, dialectically, that's not really what's at issue in metaphysical emergence. There's just far too much of that kind of emergence, so that would not be relevant to trying to make sense of the contrast between reductive views and non-reductive physicalism, for example, or strong emergence. So I don't see that those features. I don't see them in themselves as very promising for purposes of establishing that complex systems are strongly emergent. And similarly with this idea of singularities, we'll talk more about Batterman's view down the line and offer what I think is a better understanding of what he's got in mind. To be honest, Batterman is not really interested in metaphysical emergence anyway. He's interested in these kind of explanatory connections, which is not to say that some of the considerations he offers couldn't be leveraged to try to make sense of metaphysical emergence of complex systems in a way that I will do down the line. So anyway, going back to the question of strong emergence of complex systems, my preferred approach to strong emergence is one that kind of cuts to the chase of what I think the British emergentists really had in mind when they appealed to nonlinearity or to in-principle unpredictability. I think what they're really trying to get at is the idea that there's a new fundamental interaction on the scene. Okay, and I think this is something that McLaughlin confirms in his paper. So, on my preferred implementation of the schema for strong emergence, I just say, okay, well, it involves a novel fundamental interaction. And I think that strong emergence is ultimately going to be relative to sets of fundamental interactions. So I think this is the best way to understand what's going on here. So here on, I think I'm on page 4, we've got interaction relative, strong emergence, where a token feature S is going to be strongly emergent from a token feature P relative to some fundamental interactions in some set F, just in case, again, you have the co-temporal material conditional dependence condition, and S has at least one token power that is not identical with any token power of P that is grounded only in fundamental interactions in F. So this approach is presupposing, and I fill this in my book and elsewhere to some degree, the idea that there's a connection between the powers that an entity has and the fundamental interactions that are on the scene. So certain powers are grounded in certain fundamental interactions. Here I'm using the expression grounding schematically, right? Not as involving some kind of primitive dependence relation. We have to do some work and figure out what exactly is the relation between powers and fundamental interactions, but that powers are in some way or another grounded in fundamental interactions, I think is uncontroversial. So, the fact that I'm, sitting in this chair is in some sense going to be a matter of both gravity and electromagnetism and so on. Or the fact that the pin is attracted to the magnet, that has to do with the fundamental electromagnet, fundamental electromagnetic interaction as opposed to the gravitational interaction and so on. So more needs to be said to fill in the details there about what exactly that grounding relation consists in, but that there is such a metaphysical dependence relation, I think is pretty straightforward. Now, what's interesting about understanding strong emergence in these terms is that there's a kind of historically, scientifically supported criterion for strong emergence, for there being a novel fundamental interaction, which can then provide kind of an empirical criterion for whether there is actually strong emergence in a given case. And so here I like to advert back to, the original motivations for the weak nuclear interaction is motivated by an apparent violation of a conservation law, right? So rather than admit, accept that the conservation law was violated, a novel fundamental interaction was posited in order to balance the books. So this is kind of a nice, recognizable descendant of apparent violations of linearity as indicative of a novel fundamental interaction, and apparent violations of a conservation law as indicative of a novel fundamental interaction. So, in principle, we could test for the strong emergence of, a given complex system by considering, what would be the energies or associated conserved quantities associated if there were only fundamental physical interactions, and or not an interaction that kind of operates only at this certain level of complexity, and then actually performing the experiment and seeing what the results are, comparing the results. So, viable, compatible, with naturalism and so on, that's all great. But it's worth noting that at present, we don't seem to have any good motivation for thinking that complex systems, especially of the non-mental variety, are in fact strongly emergent in this sense, where they do involve a novel fundamental interaction. But it's worth observing that there is this criterion which everybody could agree on, unlike, just saying, oh, we've got relational holism or we've got a kind of singularity. People could say, well, why should that actually be indicative of a novel fundamental interaction? This is a good criterion. It's just that, the relevant experiments haven't been done, so we couldn't actually, as it stands, rule out that certain systems are strongly emergent. Okay, now turning to complex systems and their weak emergence, I have here 3 different cases, and since I'm going on too long, I'm just going to kind of skim some of these cases, and because they all have in common a similar problem. So Marc Bedeau suggests, he appeals to algorithmic incompressibility as a kind of, a feature of weak emergence of the sort that would be compatible with physicalism, and he likes to use, say, the illustrative case of a glider gun in the game of life, And the idea, again, is that when you have certain complex systems, you can't predict what they're going to do, even though you're sure that the dynamical laws are physically acceptable. There's nothing new going on, right? No new fundamental interactions, especially in the game of life. The rules are what they are, but you can't, you don't have any kind of closed or analytic way of saying what the system is going to do. You just have to set up the initial conditions, the system with its initial conditions, and let it roll and see what happens. Okay, so you might think that that sounds pretty epistemic, but Bedeau wants to insist that, in fact, look, algorithmic, an understanding of weak emergence based on algorithmic incompressibility is, in fact, a form, does encode metaphysical emergence. Why? Because whether a system, dynamical laws are algorithmically incompressible or not is an objective fact. And all I just want to say there is that that's the wrong kind of objective fact. You need to have a kind of distinction between the seemingly emergent goings on and the configurational goings on that supports the ontological and causal autonomy of the emergent goings on. So so far as algorithmic incompressibility goes, that in itself doesn't do this trick. And in fact, Bedeau sometimes says things like the macro goings on are ontologically and causally reducible to the micro goings on. So in that case, they're not really metaphysically emergent. Now, other times, Bedeau says, well, look, these guys are also metaphysically emergent in that they participate in certain macro patterns. Now, I think that's great. That's a great way to start thinking about metaphysical emergence. There's macro patterns that are more general than the patterns that are associated with the lower level cells, for example. So the pattern associated with the glider gun is, more general. We could form some special science glider laws, right, to apply to it. Great start. However, just the observation that you have a more general macro pattern is not enough to block reducibility. So it's not enough to prevent the reductionists from coming in and saying, well, actually, you don't have distinctness. I'm going to identify a glider gun with, okay, I can't identify it with a certain, one configuration, but I'll identify it with, for example, a disjunction of all the possible configurations, right? And this is, in fact, a standard reductionist move in response to, the sort of consideration I was raising earlier when I was talking about the prima facie appearances of compositional flexibility or more general special science laws or et cetera. They'll say, okay, fine. Maybe I can't identify this mental state with any one brain state because the mental state is multiply realizable. Fine, I'll identify it with a disjunction of physical states. So reductionists have strategies for accommodating macro patterns, is what I'm trying to say. And Bedeau doesn't say anything to block those strategies. So as it stands, as stated, his kind of best case for, glider guns in particular being weakly emergent he doesn't seal the deal. Now Sandra Mitchell, she appeals not to algorithmic incompressibility, but rather to another feature of complex systems, namely dynamic self-organization. And her favorite case is that of flocking birds, right? So she wants to say, again, ontologically, there's just birds. It's all compatible with physical monism. And she appeals to these kind of feedback loops between the components, the birds in this case, as suggesting that there's kind of group level, features, group level features and so on. But she is assuming that, something like the fact that there are nonlinear interactions is itself enough to get you to metaphysical emergence. And even less compellingly, she sometimes just suggests that interaction among the parts generates properties which none of the individual components possess, right? But we've already been saying that the fact that the interaction between the parts produces, properties of the whole that are different from any properties of the parts. That's not what we're trying to characterize when we understand metaphysical emergence. So it's worth observing that a reductionist can help themselves to nonlinear interactions between the components. They're not restricted just to a linear world, right? Not least because fundamental physical laws are nonlinear. So her case also fails to seal the deal. Then turning to Bob Batterman's appeal to universality and stability under perturbation as it's relevant, in particular to these kind of chaotic, complex systems that involve phase transitions. So I think, again, whether he's actually interested in metaphysical emergence or not, we can look at his work, and I think it's very, ultimately I'm going to appeal to one of the features he highlights, namely an elimination in micro-level degrees of freedom as kind of the best case for understanding weak emergence. But he in most of his work, he talks just about universality or stability under perturbation, which is something that applies, not just to systems undergoing phase transitions, but more generally special science entities are, they're stable under micro perturbation, so to speak. But again, this kind of approach doesn't block reducibility. So these are really universality, stability under perturbation. These are kind of two sides of the same coin. They just mean that the macro system engages in behaviors that are similar that, even when the underlying composition can be quite diverse. So this is a variation on the theme of multiple realizability, a variation on the theme of macro level patterns that are more general than the micro level goings on that constitute them. So the same concern that attached to Bedeau's account applies to Batterman's account, as stated. So none of these, neither appeal to algorithmic incompressibility or macro patterns or dynamic self-organization or universality / stability under perturbation. None of them seal the deal that complex systems are even weakly emergent. For all these authors have said, a reductionist can just say, yeah, fine, I can handle all that, okay? So I want to briefly put my own preferred account on the table and say, well, I think it does better. So that my preferred account picks up not on universality and stability under perturbation per se, but rather on this other feature that Batterman has raised to salience, namely an elimination in micro-level degrees of freedom. So degree of freedom, in general, this is a parameter in a minimal set needed to describe an entity as being in some characteristic state. And usually these are relativized to coordinates. I'm just going to suppress that for purposes of discussion, but most of you will be familiar with the idea of a degree of freedom that's associated with certain characteristic states. For example, the configuration state, tracking the position. So a free point particle will have 3 configuration degrees of freedom, and a system of n free point particles will have 3 times n configuration DOF. There's also kinematic DOF, which track the velocities or the momenta. And so you've got like a velocity associated with each of the configuration DOF. So a free point particle will have 6 kinematic DOF. And then you have a dynamic state, which tracks energies, which determine the motion. So typically you're going to have at least 1 dynamic DOF per configuration coordinate for the kinetic energy. And then you might also have other dynamic DOF, which will be tracking configurations to potential energies. So I really like the notion of a degree of freedom in general as a way of understanding like the individuation of scientific entities, because you can see that different entities can share. They can both have position, but their degrees of freedom, the degrees of freedom that are needed to specify the entities as being in this characteristic state, position or having a certain energy, and so on. The fine-grained details about the degrees of freedom that are needed to characterize certain entities as being in a given characteristic state, I think serve as a really great basis for individuating those entities and saying whether they're distinct or not, among other things. So here's my, I'm for purposes of time suppressing a bunch of detail, but my degree of freedom-based approach to weak emergence is here. And I want to say, I'm talking, I just cut out the feature middleman. I'm just talking about an entity in this paper. So for continuity with my previous work, I'll just present it in terms of entities. You've got some entity weakly emergent from some system of entities, E sub I. E is composed by these E sub I as a result of imposing some constraints on the E sub I. And then for some characteristic state of that big E entity, at least one of the degrees of freedom that are required to characterize the system of unconstrained EI as being in that state is eliminated from the degree of freedom required to characterize big E as being in that state. And just for purposes of ensuring that big E is physically acceptable, the third condition requires that all of its characteristic states are either, they have the same DOF or restricted DOF or eliminated DOF. There's no new DOF that are associated with big E. And also you have to require that the law-governed features of E are completely determined by the law-governed features of the EI when the EI stand in these relations that are relevant to their composing big E. So that big E is not identical to, that big E is physically acceptable is pretty clear given the conditions, so I'm just going to gloss over that. What we really need to look at is the ontological and causal irreducibility, this should say, of these DOF eliminated entities. What I want to suggest is that goings-on that have eliminated degrees of F cannot be reduced, ontologically reduced, to any lower level goings-on. Why not? Because I think laws that operate on entities at a certain level are sensitive to what DOF are characterizing their inputs. So if you have, the quantum laws, for example, the entities that are input into the quantum laws have to, the information that's associated with those goings on, those entities or those features, has to include all the relevant information about quantum spin. If that quantum spin gets eliminated, right, in the classical limit, for example, then you are not going to be able to take those features or that entity and input it into the quantum laws. So the quantum laws will not know what to do with them. So this is actually, I think my hand is a little garbled here, but this is really, no, it's okay. So you get ontological irreducibility by attention to the role that DOF play with respect to the inputs into the laws at a given level. So eliminations of DF render an entity or feature unsuited to be identified with any lower level entity, because those lower level entities have to, if they're going to be governed by those lower level laws, they have to contain all the information about all the DOF that the laws require in order to operate. Entities with an eliminated DOF, for example, that don't have DOF corresponding to quantum spin, will not be suited unto identification with any quantum level entities, because those quantum level entities do contain all that information. So by Leibniz's law, they can't be identified. As far as causal autonomy, again, these DOF is connected to, what powers. I think you can connect DOF not just to the laws, but also to the powers that entities or features have. It's going to be the case that any power of an weakly DOF-based weak emergent is going to be token identity identical to a power of its base level goings on. But for macro objects in the classical limit, the reverse will not be the case. For the system of EI that composes this big E, or associated features, is going to have powers associated, for example, with quantum spin. But in the classical limit, this guy is not going to have those any powers associated with quantum spin because it doesn't have quantum DOF. So you'll end up with satisfaction of the proper subset condition. And I think there's another route to this same, satisfaction of proper subset condition that proceeds by looking at what powers an entity has as being generated by the laws that govern the science, the laws in the science treating it. So the laws of the theory treating big E will express what happens when certain lower level entities stand in relations that are associated with the lower level constraints. So the constraints have to be in place in order for that science, that special science, to be operative, so to speak. But the laws treating the system of the EI are going to express what happens when those entities stand in those relations and also when they don't. So the lower level laws, cover a broader range of contexts or circumstances than the special science laws. And so again, we end up with a case to be made that big E has fewer powers. It doesn't have any new powers as compared to the system of EI, but it has fewer powers actually. Okay, so that's a case that proceeds by connecting powers to the laws. Okay, so now here's a very fast argument that complex systems are weakly emergent, and this appeals to Batterman's observation that complex systems undergoing phase transitions, which are a variety of chaotic complex systems, so I'll just call them that for now, that they have eliminated DOF. Okay, so this is because the renormalization group method applies to them, and it applies to a system when the system has DOF that are eliminated as compared to the system of its composing entities. As he says, the renormalization group transformation eliminates those degrees of freedom, those microscopic details which are inessential or irrelevant for characterizing the system's dominant behavior at criticality. So you can argue as follows. Systems that can be modeled by the renormalization group method have eliminated DOF. That's what Batterman observes. chaotic complex systems are modeled by the renormalization group method. So therefore, chaotic complex systems have eliminated DOF. Then, appealing to the considerations I talk about in more detail in Wilson 2010, and I just canvassed very sketchily, systems with eliminated DOF, which also satisfy the other conditions in my account, are weakly emergent. Therefore, chaotic complex systems are weakly emergent. I think you can also make cases that the complex systems that are discussed in Badau's and Mitchell's work satisfy the conditions of a degree of freedom-based account. And I discussed that in my book. So, to conclude, complex systems have often been offered as cases of metaphysical emergence, but previous accounts of such systems as either strongly or weakly emergent don't establish this result. And while strong emergence of some complex systems may be an open empirical question, because the relevant experiments just haven't been performed yet, in any case, attention to the relations between degrees of freedom of complex systems, certain complex systems anyway, and underlying base configurations or features does in fact support taking these to be at least weakly emergent. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
So now, as I announced previously, James, you can take your time, and then Jessica, if you want, you can reply to James.
Okay, good, thanks. Well, I won't say too much, but I want to say something about timescales and dynamics and about the relationship between reduction and emergence and about why I think non-linearity is a red herring. Puzzle about this idea that we define emergence in terms of a kind of subset or superset relation of properties. So just to sort of preface each of those things a little bit, Jessica's account relies on the idea of co-temporal dependence. And I just want to observe that when we think about cases of emergence, at least, I mean, I don't know whether this is emergence. Well, this is another general point I want to make, actually, is that Jessica said she wasn't interested in the kind of emergence that you get when you have lots of parts and you get a whole that has new properties. Now, I don't know whether the kind of emergence I'm interested in is always going to be like that. I mean, I would have thought it pretty much always is, but I wouldn't have thought it wasn't thereby interesting. So I guess we just have different interests. But in any case, in those cases, what's relevant is the interactions and the dynamics of the constituents. And often what's going on is that they're happening over very short timescales compared to the timescales of the emergent properties. And so the idea of a kind of, although Jessica says you don't want to think in terms of instantaneity, but I think it's a bit more complicated in the sense that there isn't kind of a feature of the lower level system or a configuration on which the emergent thing is depending. It's rather that the interactions and dynamics of this lower level system at a different scale look like something else or give rise to something else. Now, here come to the point of reduction and emergence and relationship between them. Now, Jessica sort of argued at several points and sort of dialectically, well, that can't be right because the reductionist would allow that. But of course, I mean, in that sense, I mean, Jessica's entitled to use the word emergence any way she wants, but there is a literature in philosophy of physics of people arguing about how reduction explains emergence. And so I'm thinking here of, and certainly are compatible. So I'm thinking here of the work of Jeremy Butterfield and then other people more recently, including Ellen Knox and Alexander Franklin. And I'm going to use an example from Alexander's talk that he gave at the University of York in the philosophy of physics seminar the other night, which I hosted and also replied to. So it's a good example. An example is metals being robust. So, you know, we'd have a piece of china or pottery, which is hard and rigid and has all these properties, but if you tap it with a hammer, it breaks, whereas an iron teapot doesn't. So you ask why, and the answer is explained in terms of the transport properties of the deformations of the structure, of the lattice structure. The idea of this example is just it's one of many in which the robustness of the high-level property is, you know, this emergent stability, this lack of fragility, is explained reductively. Now, to go to Jessica's account in terms of degrees of freedom, I would have thought there that that can't be incompatible with reductionism, because, I mean, so take the example of a bead on a wire, right? So as everyone well knows, if I have a bead on a wire, then I can use a Lagrangian formalism of classical mechanics and describe it with 1 degree of freedom. So it's a nice example of reduction of degree of freedom. But surely, I mean, that doesn't settle whatever it, I mean, surely you can't sort of present reductionists with a bead on a wire and say, so you're wrong, and that they'd never thought of that case. I mean, that just seems quite odd. And so I'm just not convinced. I guess, I mean, by what the question is that we're talking about when we're talking about this supposedly separate question that isn't about parts and wholes or anything, especially because all the cases of emergence that seem to occur in the natural world, or at least lots of them, are just a straight consequence of there being parts interacting over time. Okay, now when it comes to complex systems, I think there's something very important to say, which is that this business about nonlinearity and chaotic dynamics is a bit of a red herring, because chaotic dynamical systems needn't be complex in the sense in which anyone talks about complex systems. So if I take an isolated chaotic pendulum, it's chaotic, but it's not complex. Nobody really talks about that like it's complex. Now, it's complex insofar as it's a piece of condensed matter, and you might think condensed matter is complex, but it's not complex qua pendulum, not complex qua chaotic evolution or chaotic behavior in its evolution. So what's really important about complex systems, in every one that people talk about, is that there are parts and they're interacting, and the interactions are iterated. So you take that, I should mention, by the way, everything I said about complex systems is to do with this collaboration between me and Carolina Weisner, and this is her, my book. And we've got ants on the front. And the point about the ants is they don't show any interesting behavior unless they repeatedly interact. And likewise, birds flocking. Although you don't need a very large number of them, they do need to repeatedly interact. You need to iterate the interactions. So I would say that's absolutely crucial to complex systems. Now, as I think Jessica's recognizes, you know, in the issues about levels might be a bit orthogonal here, because swarms of insects, it's not like they exist at different scales. I mean, obviously, the swarm is bigger than the individual insect, but they're not kind of existing at different levels of reality. And more generally, if the project here is to make sense of the idea of levels of reality, then I would be very skeptical of wanting to do that, or thinking that that idea you know, really makes sense, unless we're just talking pragmatically about often, you know, it's appropriate to think about different levels, but not to think, yeah, you know, the reality comes stratified into levels or something. And if it does, then certainly in complex systems, the levels aren't physical levels. They're just the relevant scale is not physical scale. It's just number of interactions and number of parts plus interactions or something like that. Now, the other thing I was going to say was about rejection of degree of freedom. I mean, maybe this is a bit of a finicky point, but it seems important. I mean, suppose we take phase space, n particles, classical, and somebody says, yeah, so there's 6n degrees of freedom. And then somebody else immediately points out that none of the dynamics depends on absolute position. And what we really want is 6n minus 6 degrees of freedom. I mean, it sounds like what we're saying there is that that's metaphysical emergence because we've got fewer degrees of freedom, but that doesn't sound right at all. And so for the case of both the bead on the wire and that case, I'm skeptical about whether reduction of degrees of freedom is sufficient for emergence, even in the sense that Jessica's talking about. And I would have thought, I mean, the critical thing is the emergence of novel features or properties that then appear in laws. Again, that might just be that I'm just not interested in the issue that Jessica's interested in, because she said no one's arguing about whether that is so. And I suppose we are still arguing about whether that's so because there's some kind of failure of physicalism. And there, I think I would agree with Jessica that there isn't. But I think that's enough to give me an argument with some people, and therefore to make this emergentism contestable somehow, because it's saying that you can have some kind of physicalism plus entities at different scales. And some people would deny that. Some people would say, no, if you've got physicalism, you can't have that. Good, I'll probably shut up in a minute. I suppose, I mean, just a terminological point is, I think, yeah, it probably is really important here that Jessica's weak emergence is still supposed to be some kind of metaphysical thing, and that lots of people use weak emergence to mean merely epistemic. And so if you are thinking that, you know, don't be confused, because Jessica means what she says by it, not the idea that weak equals epistemic and strong equals ontic. Both her weak and her strong are both supposed to be ontic. Okay, good. Well, look, I mean, I've said some things, and you know, we haven't got that much longer left. So I hope I've, you know, done justice to what Jessica's had to argue, which was very, very extensive, and I certainly haven't had time to talk about all of it. And there's lots more that could be said. So thanks very much.
Thank you, James. That was great. Jess?
Yeah, thanks so much, James. Those are very rich comments. I'll just address a couple of things. First, I just want to clarify that I'm not suggesting, when I say that the target of my, you know, my investigation doesn't pertain to emergence as involving parts, like, you know, sort of different features between parts or wholes or whatever. I don't mean to suggest that parts in interaction isn't completely relevant to the question of metaphysical emergence. So I agree with James that most cases of emergence are going to involve parts interacting, especially if we're talking about, you know, well, really, I think all emergence is going to ultimately have to, will reflect or encode parts interacting. What I was suggesting is that just saying, oh, look, you know, this proton doesn't have color, but if you put you know, various particles together, then you end up with something colored. That in itself is, or even if you say, oh, this thing has a certain mass, and you put them together and it has a different mass, just a mere difference in properties between properties of parts and properties of the whole, I want to say that itself is not sufficient for an interesting form of emergence. That's not to say that the properties of parts interaction are not, you know, part of what I'm trying to understand. So I don't think we really disagree about that. So I just want to be clear about that. I do want to say, however, what was I going to say about, you're talking about scales, or like the case of, oh yeah, good. Okay, the case of, the iron teapot and metals being robust and so on and so forth. James suggested that those are cases where you have reduction, and that explains emergence. So reducibility and emergence are somehow not incompatible. I want to just clarify that the kind of reducibility I'm interested in is, as James mentioned earlier, is ontic. Okay, I don't want to say that there's not sort of an potential explanatory reduction that's going on in those cases. I just want to ask this question: is it not just explanatory? I mean, are we not just understanding how we end up with these, the robustness at the macro level in terms of transport properties of deformation of lattice structure or whatever it is? Of course, I agree that there are those kinds of explanations of the macro property. So at least in the cases of weak emergence. My question is just, is this property of robustness, is it to be identical? Can it be identified with some lower level feature or other goings on? And so I've offered some, a criterion, one criterion or a schema and one implementation of that schema for making sense of that. So explanatory reducibility is compatible, I think, with ontological irreducibility. So my remarks there are just to say that I don't mean to ignore this section of the literature, but my understanding is that that is really targeting more of explanatory reducibility. So just to be perfectly clear, I'm just interested in this question about whether a given feature, in particular, or entity, let's focus on a feature, can this feature be taken to be identical with some lower level feature or complex thereof, like a disjunction, etc. And so there, I think the eliminations in DOF do provide you with a principled reason to think that such identification is not in the works, notwithstanding a complete explanation, so to speak, of the higher level goings on. Compatible with physicalism, and the whole idea of the proper subset strategy is that, again, none of the powers of the macro goings on are different from the lower level powers, so you would expect that you would have an explanatory reduction in at least most cases. So as far as the question of whether an elimination and degree of freedom would in fact suffice for metaphysical emergence, I'm just going to bite that bullet and say, no, I think that's in fact the case. Again, with no connotations about, a lack of explanatory reducibility, but just saying that in fact you don't get the identification. So I think, for example, an electrostatic sphere with fewer degrees of freedom with respect to the charge distribution is the electromagnetic field that it generates. That is a case of metaphysical emergence, and I'm okay with that. And I don't think that, yeah, I don't think that's a problem. I think that's fine. What else might I say? Let's see. Swarms. You said swarm doesn't exist at different levels of reality, and I just want to say, well, maybe it does, right? So it will depend on this question of whether we can make sense of weak emergence being in place, either as per the schema or as I prefer to implement it, as involving an elimination of degrees of freedom. Notice, by the way, I do say elimination. Elimination is different from a reduction in degrees of freedom. So just to be clear, an elimination of freedom is one where the degree of freedom is just like, it's not part of the characterization of the entity at the higher level at all. It's not just that it's given a specific value. So for example, if you had a free point particle it had 3 configuration DOF, and then I constrain it to a plane, that's not a case of elimination and degree of freedom. That's just one of reduction of degree of freedom, where I've given one of the degrees of freedom a fixed value. and that I do not think that I haven't made a case that that involves weak emergence. So it has to be that the degree of freedom is just not part of the degrees of freedom that are needed to characterize the entity as, relevant to its law-governed properties and behavior. So I think I will stop there. I hope that was clarifying, but thanks a lot, James.
Yeah, no, thanks. Sorry, I'm sorry for misunderstanding that last point then. Okay, so that's interesting. So you're going to say, like, and what you mean specifically is a higher level description that doesn't mention those degrees of freedom, right? But that's, I mean, that's just completely ubiquitous. I mean, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so questions from the floor? You can either raise your hand or write a Q in the chat. Okay, Joe, you can go first.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk. Very interesting stuff. So I have a small question specifically about causal emergence and about how that fits into the picture you presented right at the end there. So it seems like what you get first from the degrees of freedom story is something like emergent laws, and that seems more straightforward. So you get different kinds of laws at a higher scale or something like this. And then there were two routes to get causal emergence as well on that picture. I'm interested in the second specifically, which is where the emergent causes come kind of downstream of the emergent laws. And what I'm wondering, I suppose, is on that kind of picture, if that's the route somebody ended up going, do you really have emergent causes, or just something like sui generis causes at different scales or something? Because they're not really emerging from the lower level causes as such. It's just that there are different kinds of causes autonomously at different scales. Does that make sense as a kind of concern, or is that missing something?
Well, I don't really think in terms of, well, there's a way in which I'm thinking about emergent causes. I would associate that with strong emergence, okay, where the notion of a power and a cause are sort of interchangeable. So in the case of strong emergence, the novel power is one to enter into the production of a certain kind of an effect. So you could think of strong emergence as involving, an emergent cause. Weak emergence, I don't think of it quite in those terms, right? Because every power of a weak emergent is token identical to a power of its lower level goings on. So that wouldn't be as appropriate.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next I have Vera, then Lev, and Ans. Vera, you're next.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for your talk. So just a very quick question, because I didn't actually get the difference between the elimination of degrees of freedom and the reduction of degrees of freedom. So would you say that, for instance, when, in the case of idealized model, then that is the case of reduction, but not elimination of degrees of freedom? But in the case of emergence is elimination. Maybe I didn't get it. Yeah, if you can, thank you.
Well, I wasn't thinking about idealized models per se. I'm just thinking about, the systems themselves. But once we start thinking about the DOF that are needed to characterize some entity as being in a certain characteristic state that is relevant to its law-governed properties and behavior, and we're comparing, the degrees of freedom that are needed to characterize this guy as being in some characteristic state as compared to those needed to characterize this guy as being in that same characteristic state, right? Then you have, I identify three different sorts of relations that might be, there might actually four now that I think about it, but at least three, right? So assuming that there's no new DOF, degrees of freedom here, you could have a reduction in degrees of freedom, you can have a restriction in degrees of freedom, and then you can have an elimination in degrees of freedom. So that tripartite distinction is assuming that all the degrees of freedom are sort of present at the lower level. Now, a reduction of degree of freedom would be like this case where you give the degree of freedom a fixed value. And so again, this paradigm case is, this free point particle, it has 3 configuration degrees of freedom, and now I constrain it to the plane. So now, it's not like it only has 2 degrees of freedom now, it's just that it still has 3 degrees of configurational degrees of freedom, it's just that one of them has been given a constant value. Restriction in degree of freedom is similar, only the idea is be more like the atoms in a molecule, right? They're restricted to be in a certain range, when they are part of that molecule. So you can't have one on the other side of the universe. But so there's the degrees of freedom are given a certain, they're not given a fixed value, but a sort of range of values. But again, still, you have all the degrees of freedom are associated. Each atom still has 3 configurational degrees of freedom. It's just that there's certain kind of restriction on some of the, what values those degrees of freedom can take. But then elimination of degree of freedom is one where, that degree of freedom is just eliminated entirely from the specification. And that's the kind I have argued is more relevant to understanding weak emergence, because then the idea is just that those degrees of freedom are just no longer, not even with a fixed value or a restricted range of values, are just not any part of the characterization of the entity as being, in the relevant characteristic states.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I should have, if I had a little bit more time, I would have gone into that detail, because I think it's relevant for understanding the view. There might be a case to be made that a reduction or a restriction in degree of freedom also could give you some kind of weak emergence, but I'm worried that would render it too ubiquitous. So I haven't tried to make that case.
Okay, Lev?
Jessica, maybe excuse me for this kind of question. I really, the question is, should I worry as a physicist? Because I got very little from your talk. It's, I had many terms which I'm familiar with, but I couldn't get the point. Kind of, I was worried when you said that there are basic interactions are non-linear, but James said that it's maybe illusion. So maybe you took and you didn't react. So maybe you don't think so. So if I'm a physicist, reductionist, naturalist, whatever, and think that physics, all electrons and protons explain everything, should I worry? Because what I understand that you say that there is maybe philosophical concept that attraction of complex object like people is conceptually different than attraction of electron and proton. But I don't think they should worry me. And the reason, what maybe I worry that I understood little, because there is one question, emergence is a kind of interesting question. And there is a program of people who are trying to find emergence of classical world from quantum world. I'm not sure that we need this program. I think maybe it's a mistake, the program, but I'm not sure. And this was the reason why I attended the talk. And I didn't get any kind of clue toward answering this question. Well, what I was supposed to and I missed something, or this is kind of different question, different on a different level, and I shouldn't worry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, maybe you missed something. Okay, look, if you're interested in this question about the emergence of the classical world from the quantum goings on, I mean, my account, DOF-based account, does potentially provide you with a way of making sense of that. Not in a way that you should worry about, but in a way that would make sense of the idea of genuine emergence, the distinctness of the macro world, the classical macro world, yet its complete dependence on physical goings on. So completely compatible with physicalism, weak emergence is especially, you know, understood as per my schema or implemented as I prefer, as involving an elimination degrees of freedom, can make sense of that. Now, some physicalists don't have any concern, they don't think it's an interesting project to try to make sense of the distinctness or some kind of distinctive efficacy of higher level phenomena. My arguments will not convince that person. So that could also be, something that you're thinking. However, I do offer somebody who's curious to know whether you could make sense of a leveled structure, so to speak, compatible with physicalism. I do think that my discussion offers you a way to do that, right? So there's elimination of quantum degrees of freedom in the classical limit. I think that is one strategy for making sense of there being distinct higher level macro phenomena. So I find that useful because I feel like this is a nice way of preserving the appearances. But nothing that I have said is undercutting somebody who's a hardcore reductionist. So the way I put it in my book is that I see my job as providing the non-reductionist, both at the physicalist and the non-physicalist varieties, providing them with ways to stay on their own horse, not to push the reductionist off their horse.
Can you say a little more about this? You mentioned spin, and you said that, I cannot talk about it in classical physics. And my lesson is classical physics is just plain wrong. I should, the nature is quantum. And if I go to laboratory, I see something which I cannot explain if I don't introduce a spin. It's not that I can eliminate it in any way. I have to take it in account to understand what I see around. Can you explain what do you mean, how you get classical physics out of quantum by limiting degree of freedom? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, that wasn't quite what I was saying when I said that there's an elimination in degrees of freedom in the classical limit. I mean, I'm just citing Feynman there, right? So Feynman is just saying, oh, how do you get the laws of Newtonian mechanics? Well, in the limit, you're going to eliminate certain degrees of freedom. Spin becomes irrelevant. Now, again, I'm not providing you with any positive argument against giving a pragmatic or, as you would say, error theoretic spin to that result. So, you can continue to stay on your horse and just say, well, all right, that's fine. Really, spin continues to be, quantum spin continues to be operative at the macro level and so on and so forth, and those laws are just strictly speaking false. That's a line, and I'm not providing, I haven't said anything to prevent you from holding on to that line. However, if you wanted to make sense of those laws, not as false, but really as special science laws, which are tracking a genuine level of causal grain, metaphysical and causal grain, which some people have wanted to do and which I think is consonant with the autonomy of the special sciences and with ordinary appearances, then I provided a reason or a basis, a strategy for you to do so. And really, I think that's the best one can do, because it's not, in philosophical context, it's going to be extremely rare that I would provide a no-go theorem for reductionism. That's just that's very hard to do. As we have known for a long time, one can hold on to almost any thesis, come what may. So it may be of interest to you, even if you are not convinced that you need to make metaphysical good sense of leveled reality, that there's at least a way to do so for those who are inclined.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a next question by Hans. And by the way, let me say, James, of course, if you have follow-ups, feel free to jump in at any time. I see you're writing sometimes on the chat.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I just think it's pretty complicated because it's not like spin. I mean, spin is a new quantum property, right? That's true. And I think this is an interesting point. I mean, Jessica made this point about how when you had the weak force, you get a new fundamental interaction. The interesting thing about that, of course, is you get it at a lower scale. I mean, so strong and weak forces are kind of only come about with we only understand them through microphysics. So it's not actually, they're not new forces that come about with big things. You only find out about them anyway with little things. But in any case, when you talk about spin, it's a completely new quantum property, but it's completely relevant at the macroscopic level because otherwise there'd be no magnets. Magnets are things that have aligned spin, right? So to some degree, that's how you understand ferromagnetism. So it's not like spin as a property disappears in the classical limit, is what I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let me address another thing that you said in the comments first, James, and then I'll get to that too. The bead on the wire case, I don't think that's not a case of elimination. It's a case of restriction in degrees of freedom. So that's not a case that I would.
What I mean is that there's now 1 degree of freedom, which is the position of the bead on the wire, instead of like the 2 to the 10 to the 23 degrees of freedom of all the particles.
Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, or like think of like rolling a ball across. I mean, a ball. When you make a load of. I mean, if I've got a load of clay, then I make it into a ball, and now the ball's dynamics can be governed by quite simple. If a ball's on a flat surface, I've just got center of mass, and the angular position, and I don't need very many degrees of freedom, and none of them are the original degrees of freedom.
Mm-hmm. I agree that there's more to be said here for these kind of cases, but like the idea, I don't think that this is really a completely new degree of freedom. You're just going to understand that as being ultimately reducible to the more basic configurational degrees of freedom. But I agree that there's more that needs to be said there. I do say a little bit more about this kind of case in my book when I'm considering the possibility that actually there's some new degrees of freedom, but so I have to say more about how some of these, like the ones that I think are operative in that case, are in fact really not new. They're not really new. As far as spin continuing to be present, look, I know that there's going to be cases where the quantum goings on will be relevant, even in the case of Schrödinger's cat or whatever, right? So the idea is not that all macro phenomena are completely such as to abstract away from any of the certain quantum details, such as spin or other quantum goings on features. It's just that there are comparatively abstract macro level systems of laws, for example, associated with Newton's laws and so on, which do characterize phenomena in ways that are such that the quantum goings on are completely irrelevant. So we should I would want to distinguish those two cases. I'm not claiming that quantum phenomena are never relevant at the macro level. Obviously, that would be false. I'm just claiming that we can make sense of special science goings on, which are such that they basically, they specify, they stipulate, you might even say, but still in a metaphysically relevant manner, that the quantum goings on are not relevant. So those are the goings on that would be in the classical limit, where you have an eliminated degrees of freedom. And spin is like in Newton's laws, it's not relevant to understanding those phenomena that are in those special circumstances as per the special science that treats these goings on, do not have quantum spin as one of the DOF that are relevant to characterizing their law-governed properties and behavior. So I think what you are saying is compatible with what I'm saying. It's just, look, the special sciences are special in the sense that they only operate, or they're only intended to operate under certain special circumstances, not just ones where the temperatures are relatively low, right? But also where, you know, the quantum spin are not relevant. That's the idea anyway.
I suppose, I mean, I think what people, whenever people sort of talk about classical world or classical objects, I always sort of think about the fact that the stability of matter is explained by quantum mechanics. And so it's hard to see in what sense quantum mechanics is not metaphysically relevant to anything. I mean, insofar as you talk about material bodies, like billiard balls, the subject of classical physics, well, there just wouldn't be any stable matter if it wasn't for quantum mechanics. Now, obviously, you know that, right? But I suppose the problem is, if we're talking about metaphysical relevance here, I mean, surely quantum mechanics is metaphysically relevant if it's what explains the stability of matter, and these laws only govern things that are like macroscopic matter.
Again, I want to grant completely, obviously, that, you know, those quantum goings on are determinative and explanatorily, you know, relevant to the macro properties, but that's just a different issue. The question is just about the metaphysical characterization of the properties that are at issue. So, you know, the configuration that is in fact acting as the explanatory basis for the higher level properties, you know, that's there, it's doing its thing. If it weren't there, you wouldn't have this property. It's completely crucial in all the ways that you're getting at. But that's compatible with the property that eventuates from all those that complex interaction, that property itself having fewer powers than the configuration itself, and that would suffice for weak emergence, according to me.
Hans, you're next. Sorry for making you wait so long.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm another physicist trying to get a foot on the ground. So I heard the thing. I had two words that I found interesting. The one thing is the separation of time scales, and I think James said that. And the other thing is autonomy, and I think Jessica said that. And autonomy I understand as autonomous time evolution. This would be my understanding on these separated time scales, which James had mentioned. So that is kind of thing I can attach to as a physicist, and that's the same way of thinking. And there we have common ground. And usually these time scales are separated only in a finite way. I mean, there may be large separation between the time scales, but it's always finite. And that has the consequence that all these emerging levels are approximate in a sense. That's my first question, is that a problem to philosophers, that all coarse-grained emergent things are somehow approximate in nature and not completely rigorous, or is there an ontological problem with that or something like this? I mean, this is the one question, it's the approximate nature of emergent phenomena. The other question is with physicalism. Of course, like most physicists, I was an unconscious physicalist for most of my life. And when I start to think about it, then I don't understand the concept really, because physics, or our knowledge of physics, changes in time. And so whether something is accessible to a physicalist or not depends on the state of knowledge of physics. Yeah, so physicalism in the year 1000 is different from physicalism in the year 2000, probably different from the year 3000. And so as a physicalist, I could say, yeah, the physics is not yet there, but it will come later, which means it's nothing. I mean, it's just religion so I have a hard time with understanding what the concept of physicalist means at all. And you used it quite often, so maybe you can illuminate me what that means. I mean, that would be my second question. So the first was about approximate nature of emergent levels. And the second one is about physicalism being somehow time dependent and not really clear to me.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Those are both good questions. So with respect to this question of the approximate nature macro phenomena. There's two ways you could understand what it is for some goings on to have an approximate nature. One would be sort of in truth-based terms, where the idea is that it's approximate in the sense that like claims about these goings on are not really true, or they're just, you know, they're convenient. So then that's kind of a pragmatic spin where approximation doesn't have any kind of metaphysical connotations. Then there's another way to understand it in terms of something that's sort of, well, really maybe there's three ways. One is having to do with its being more general, right? Not being the full story. So it's approximate in that it tells you, you know, like there's certain goings on, but when I say, oh, look, there's a glass on my table, I haven't thereby told you like anything about the details of the glass's physical constitution. There are facts about that constitution, but just saying that there's a glass on the table doesn't tell you that. But for me, with respect to the question of truth and its role of, you know, whether if you're understanding approximate nature as one that, you know, could it be that an entity has an approximate nature but claims about the entity still be true? Again, I've tried to provide a way of making sense of that, such that just because I haven't told you the full story doesn't mean I didn't tell you something's true. A third way of understanding approximate nature would be one that adverted to a kind of indeterminacy. And I think that's a really hugely interesting subject. And as far as I know, you guys have had some one or more talks about quantum indeterminacy, and that's one of my areas of interest as well, or metaphysical indeterminacy as well. So if you're thinking about, or if one was thinking about approximate nature as indeterminate nature, or a nature that is in some respects not completely determinate. So for example, this glass has a boundary, but does it have a perfectly precise boundary? I would say no. The boundary is in some sense indeterminate. I think that's fine, and I have a story about why that's okay. But you know, to get into the details of that story would take.
Thank you, that was helpful. I tend to the second option, which means I have to restrict my range of interest. And for that, I have a perfectly healthy theory on the emerging level. That would be my feeling, and this is one of the options you seem to leave me.
So that's fine. So, you know, again, with respect to the second option, there's two ways one could go. One could kind of go reductionist, or one could go non-reductionist. And my goal here was just to provide, you know, flag that there are non-reductionist strategies as well. With respect to your second very interesting question, as it turns out, you've put your finger on a big issue in metaphysics of physicalism or science. There's a great paper out there called "There Is No Question of Physicalism," which is Crane and Meller, a classic paper by Tim Crane and Hugh Meller, which basically is pushing the line that you cannot make sense of physicalism because there's no working conception of what it is for some goings on to be physical that would render the thesis, you know, either kind of non-trivial and, you know, kind of substantive, not obviously false, or trivially true, depending on how you understand the physical. So here I will just say that I would point you maybe to my own paper on characterizing the physical, where I try to answer your question. What I see is kind of the best strategy for making sense of a view such as physicalism, notwithstanding that current physics is incomplete and likely false, right, is one which characterizes the physical entities as kind of the target of physics, right? The target subject matter of physics, with the idea being that the physical goings on are going to be those that are, this is kind of kludgy, but it's kind of the best we can do, approximately accurately treated by by physics, and which are not fundamentally mental. So this is a way of kind of blocking the possibility that physics would somehow find out that, you know, fundamental particles are conscious or anything. So we want to block that characterization of what it would be for for there to be for some goings on to be physical. But you're asking a deep question. There's more than I can, more there than I can properly respond, but I'll just say there are strategies for responding to your concern. And on my website on Characterizing the Physical, will provide you with a kind of roadmap. Maybe you can.
But even if I try to distinguish between physical and mental, or I would say maybe between conscious and unconscious, so that boundary can also move in time, that things which have been unconscious at some point become, through discoveries, become conscious. And so there is a shift between those two. They are not forever separated domains. I mean, if I'm willing to go for dualism, which I tend to for exactly that reason, because there must be a shifting boundary, and so they are kind of even qualitatively similar, because one can turn into the other. So what you said kind of, I don't think there's this eternal separation between mental and physical necessarily. I don't see a reason for that. I mean, this could change with physical discovery.
Well, distinguish the epistemology from the metaphysics. I mean, I don't think that metaphysically speaking, the boundary of the mental and the physical shifts. What we know about what's physical, what's mental could shift. So I thought that was what, the real concern is that, well, how can I be a physicalist if I don't even know what entities are physical or what the parameters of physical entities are? I think we have a pretty good grasp on, what it is for some entities to be conscious or, to have some kind of mentality. And then the only constraint or caveat on a working account of the physical, in my view, is one that, on the assumption that physicalism is supposed to contrast with something like Cartesian dualism, right, or panpsychism, according to which, the universe is conscious even at its most fundamental parts, is one that would reject the idea that the fundamental physical goings-on are conscious. And I think we have a working handle on that. By the way, notice that that's compatible with there being some indeterminacy about when some complex configuration ends up being conscious or not. A physicalist can allow that. That would be getting into the question of indeterminacy. So indeterminacy between the boundary of what's physical and mental is compatible with there being this constraint on fundamental physical entities according to which they can't be individually conscious.
Did the mental exist before there was any form of life?
No. I don't think so, but some people do. The panpsychist does.
Yeah. But you're laughing, but it's not clear to me from the arguments you just made. It seemed that the mental is kind of non-epistemic. It's not bound to be attached to human beings or any other beings.
I'm not making any kind of claim like that. I'm just saying that, in fact, if you want to be a physicalist, you want to make sense of the doctrine that all goings-on, all scientific goings-on are nothing over and above or completely metaphysically dependent on physical goings-on. And your initial question was, well, what are the physical goings-on? We don't have a perfect physics yet. So how can I be a physicalist if I don't know what the physical goings-on are, right? I thought that was your initial question. And what I was just saying is just that there are some strategies for answering your question, and the usual strategy.
I have to better understand them. I have to read more about this.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we're running out of time, but maybe if Andre, you have a very small point, you can go.
It was about it was only about the bit on a wire debate. I think it's a small question. Do you think there's time?
Yeah, you can go. Just try to make it quick. Thank you.
Yeah, it is that by what I understood about the debate, epistemologically, on that problem, the atomic nature of matter is irrelevant, and you can change a mole of coordinates and moments into the coordinate and moment of what ontologically is the Newtonian material point. So in that case, what seemed to me, the material point emerged from the atoms because of epistemological considerations. So is that the lesson I need to take of this analysis of emergency for that problem that Professor Leitman talked about?
I wouldn't give that interpretation, but I'd have to think more, I have to hear more about what you meant by sort of something emerging from epistemological considerations. What I can say just in general is that there may be other forms of emergence, metaphysical or otherwise, than I've discussed here. I've just offered really one sort of strategy for making sense of certain kinds of appearances, but I think that's compatible with there being other forms of emergence. And it would be actually very interesting if there were forms of metaphysical emergence that arose from epistemological considerations. So I will say that I don't see any in principle barrier to that possibility, if that's what you were suggesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I don't know if Jessica or James want to make a very last comment. Otherwise, we can just...
Yeah. No, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate.
You're muted.
Very interesting question.
Thanks for engaging, Jessica. I think that it would be a consequence of Jessica's view then that it's going to be that what the degrees of freedom are better be kind of coordinate independent and objective.
Yeah.
That's the relevant sense of degrees of freedom here. It's got to be some notion of like the true degrees of freedom or something.
Right on, James. Yeah, so good observation. Definitely I could use filling in.
Cool.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks, Jessica, very much again.
Thank you, James, for coming, for the comments. Thank you, everyone, and of course, thanks, Jess. Let's thank Jessica again.
And thank you, Christian, for organizing all this series of
webinars. It's the last one, but again, please feel free to join next week. There's going to be a workshop, one-day workshop on relational quantum mechanics with Rovelli himself will be joining us to comment on the talks. So if you're on the mailing list, I will send a reminder by Monday. So you're gonna have all the information and the link. So you don't need to do anything, just wait for an email. Thanks again.
It will be on Friday?
Yeah, Friday afternoon.
I just send you an email. It will be a philosophy meeting during this Friday. So there is kind of a overlap.
Yeah, I stopped looking at overlap like 6 months ago because there were so many Zoom around Europe.
But this one is a big one.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm very sorry about that. And I mean, we had enough registration, so we're gonna make this fight. Hopefully there's going to be enough people, and of course we do the recordings. So if you really want to hear both of them, you can wait for the recording.
I have a word splitter in my homepage, no problem.
Okay, nice. Okay, so see you next week.
Bye.